Welcome to Train Freediving. You're on the sofa with Sarah and Nathan, and this is my competition vlog number 5. So I'm heading into my final couple of weeks of training before the competition, and we are now full on in the peaking phase of training. And this is usually at the stage where I start to unravel a little bit, in that maybe I haven't had quite enough time in the overall training cycle that I would like, or nerves kick in, which is also to do with the amount of time I've had to prepare. But with 2 weeks away, I actually feel in a really good place, and we did my second peaking dive of this training cycle today, and things went really great. So I'm just going to hand you over to Coach to talk a little bit about the peaking phase and why it's important, and some of the things that can go wrong and have gone wrong for me in the past.
Yeah, so I think just to clarify what we mean by peaking is, like, for the past few months, Sarah's been doing, in some cases, more on and off training, and it's been a bit more sporadic, and then since we started doing this vlog, it's been much more structured and much more consistent, preparing you for the comp. So you've always been but for the past 5 months, you've been in relatively good shape for freediving. Your dynamic is always going well, your technique is good, your breath hold feels good, and all that. Now, peaking is this process that we use to get a little bit more out of the system. So just to access this extra 5%, or maybe even up to 10% of performance on top of what you're normally capable of on any day. And the way we do that is by basically stripping away all of the different types of training that we would normally be doing, and then focus purely on the competition exercise, which is do a warm-up dive and then do a target dive or a long swim. And by doing that, you basically teach your nervous system to spend, and I like to use the term spend because that's really what's happening, is we're spending all of our focus, energy, dive response, breath hold, whatever you want to call it. We teach our nervous system to spend it all in one dive, where normally in training we're doing multiple dives, so the nervous system has to conserve energy, focus, dive response, etc., for an entire session. Now, something that we're doing differently this time, and I think Sarah will tell you a little bit more about how that feels, is that normally what I do and suggest is to do all your training and then suddenly just switch to peaking, and then you go for only doing target dives. And something that you've noticed is that it's a little bit stressful for you to have that pressure of going from all this different types of enjoyable training, and then all of a sudden you have to just go warm up, target dive, and that's it for multiple weeks on an end. So this training cycle, I've given Sarah kind of a blended peaking phase, where a few weeks ago we started doing maybe 1 times 110 meter dynamic, or a 1 times static plus a long dynamic. So really kind of doing this kind of early peaking process, and then the next session we'll do regular training and to sort of ease ourselves into it. So that way, now that you're peaking and you realize, today Sarah did 130, and she felt super confident beforehand, super confident during the dive, and it was really enjoyable. And then when she got out, she said, I'm excited to do another one, I want to go for 140 next session. So this time, having that more of a blended transition into peaking, at least from my perspective, she's noticeably more confident and relaxed over the last 2 long swim sessions.
Yeah, I think you're right. But really there's 2 things we've done differently this training cycle than we've done in my last 2 training cycles to do with competition. And mostly we've been able to do these 2 things, which I'll talk about in a minute, because we've known in advance of when a competition might be. But in my last 2 competitions, we really only got notified about 6 weeks before it took place, so that really only gave me 6 weeks to think, right, I've got to get into the specific training and then practice these long swims ahead of doing a competition. So that's not a lot of time for the distances now that I'm doing. So at the beginning of the year, we got kind of told by a friend who's doing this competition that we could maybe do it around May. So I had 4 months to really build up to this, which allowed me to do those, like Nathan says, couple of months of more generalised base training before moving into a more specific, phase, targeting potential weaknesses that we thought I might have for this competition. And then building enough time, so like Nathan says, we're having this more blended approach towards the end. So instead of just for 4 or 5 sessions, it being long swim, which, as you can imagine, is quite a lot of pressure, to show up every dive session and know you're doing, almost a max attempt for quite a long distance. So instead of doing that approach, we decided to, blend it, which took the pressure off me a bit and said, okay, we're going to, maybe for a longer period running up, maybe more like 6 weeks running up, we'll intermittently do a longer swim. So we started to tune my nervous system earlier than we would do normally. And we're really happy with the result because, as I said, I did 120 on Wednesday, and I wasn't actually feeling my best Wednesday because it was a week after we had the first vaccine. I was still kind of struggling a bit from that with low energy. So I did 120, it felt really good. And then that was motivating for me to show up today, and I didn't have the nerves. I was more looking forward to doing this dive and seeing what it felt like. And my experience of this was, I did my usual warm-up dive, which was 1 minute static, 40 meter dynamic, had a rest for maybe 10 minutes, prepared myself as I would do in the competition, and then when I was ready, took my starting place and did my 130 meter dive. Now I would say probably from around 50 meters I had an urge to breathe, which is usually where I always get urge to breathe. So had this feeling come on, and honestly at that moment, of course, something passes through my brain which says, you don't have to do this, why are you doing this, why don't you just come up, end your session there and have another go next time because you've got time. But as always, I could listen to that feeling and of course come up, or I have that opportunity to decide, no, I can relax into this feeling and just get curious about how much further I can go, feeling good. So that's what I did. I turned at 60 meters and then I kept going, and then just like with always happens with me, the feeling then gets really good and it starts to feel like a really enjoyable dive, usually when my dive response kicks in. And again, really importantly, this was a no contraction dive. So yes, I did experience urge to breathe. That always happens for me, but I didn't have any contractions, which is obviously amazing, and that's what we're all aiming for here. So I didn't quit the dive, which I'm really happy with, and carried on, and turning at 120, heading towards the 130, coming up, I felt not hypoxic, in the grand scheme of things, and felt very in control. My surface protocol was all managed really well and perfectly within time. So with another 4 training dives to go, we feel now, maybe next session I can go to 140 if I want to, the session after that 150, maybe have a break before the competition, or I can have a break just before that and maybe do 150 a week before the competition. But that's plenty enough time, and to allow for anything that could come up in the meantime, anything that could happen in my regular life like work, etc., and just to allow me to enter this competition a lot more calmly, a lot more securely, a lot more confidently than perhaps the place that we've normally been in like this in the past.
Yeah.
What do you think, Coach?
Yeah, I think obviously in this is one of the longest notices that we've had for competition. So my job was a lot easier to prepare you, where we didn't have to. It wasn't like, okay, we have to do everything exactly perfectly this day, because if we don't, we're screwed and we run out of time. Yeah. So this is kind of nice, where we're like you're at 130, which is 10 meters off your best comp result. So with 4 sessions to go, so 100% guaranteed you can improve your competition result, and we don't have to rush for it. Now, something I did want to actually talk about, based on what you were saying about how you're feeling, is like, we didn't mention it. I don't remember when the last time you did. You did 120. How many sessions ago?
Wednesday. So we have.
Yeah, but so a few sessions before that, I had Sarah attempt up to 120. Yeah. And something that you mentioned was that you were very nervous before that one. You only ended up doing 110, which again was no problem, because I didn't want you to do more than, I didn't necessarily want you to do 120. I just said up to maximum, like if you feel good, go for it. And coming back to this concept of peaking, is when you start doing these long swims, it is actually physiologically and neurologically stressful. Even if mentally you're prepared for these dives, the reality is it's all of a sudden very long swim. Mm-hmm. And it is stressful, and the first one or maybe the first two aren't going to feel amazing. But the reality is, if you have confidence in the fact that your body is capable of making adaptations relatively quickly, if your peaking is structured correctly, so you're starting the first one at the right distance and you're adding the right amount of meters each time, so in your case starting at about 110, and then depending on how, we need a few reps of 110, and then we can start adding 10 meters per session. If we do it in the right way, once the adaptation happens, then you experience what you experienced today. So sometimes, like, I like to say, I don't really care. Like the first few peaking dives, I don't really care how they feel. They're not a very good representation of how well your training has been working and how well you're going to perform in the end. And there's this kind of like middle ground where it might not feel so good either before or during the dive. And that's just your nervous system responding to the fact that you're suddenly performing at a higher level than you have been. And then when it adapts, you, like you said, you experience what you had today, where it was amazing, enjoyable, and you're motivated to do more.
Yeah, and it's so important, and I think it's only really taken me 3 rounds of doing this to really understand this really crucial part of the training, because in the past, honestly, the last 2 times we've done this, again, maybe it's part of its timing, but also part of it is just experience. You know, Nathan would have these plans for me to do maybe 4 peaking dives or 5 peaking dives, and I would start off, and the first 1 or 2 would really throw me because they wouldn't feel good mentally. I didn't, and then I would worry that I wasn't going to be ready. And then as a response to my worrying that I wasn't going to be ready, instead of me shying away from it, I wanted to attack it, you know. And I do think, you know, you can be one of those 2 people. You're either fight or flight, right? And I'm a bit fighty, so I'm like, no, I'm going to go at it. Like, I'm going to make this happen. But then if you're not ready before trying to make this happen, you end up like messing it up. And that's what I always did, because I would go at it, try and push myself that little bit too hard, not ever in an unsafe way, I just want to say, like, it was always within the realm of safety, but it would still be a bit too much for my nervous system at that point. Now, having learnt those lessons from the last 2 cycles, I really understand the value of just taking your time during this phase, and also realising, as Nathan says, that maybe the first couple peaking dives aren't going to feel good, and that's completely okay, because then all of a sudden they feel amazing. You know, so if you give yourself that space, give yourself that time, and don't overdo it, and don't, you know, push yourself too hard, you can reach this lovely point. And I'm honestly, like, I'm quite excited about doing these next couple of dives, because it's the furthest and longest I've gone, and for that to feel amazing, obviously that's the Shangri-La of freediving, right? Like going longer or deeper and it feeling good. So I'm curious and excited to see what that looks like. Again, I just want to be really clear here that doesn't mean I'm not nervous. You know, that doesn't mean I just wake up in the morning and I'm like, whoa, come on, let's like bring it on, and like, you know, I have to still maintain that level of focus and discipline and motivation. The self-talk that's going on in my head when I'm doing these dives is big time. I'm having to really like pump myself up in my head to say, you've got this, you can do this, like you're ready for this, you're prepared. Because if I don't do that, of course it's easy to get in a different state of mind where you're doubtful and you're like, God, like what if my surface protocol messes up, or what if I give in to that urge to breathe, etc., etc. So, I guess my advice that I'm learning at this point is trust the peaking phase, trust what it's meant to do, trust that adaptation, that it's happening if you've done all the other things right, and then just like go into yourself and talk to yourself and reassure yourself that you're capable of this. So when you get these triggers inside of you, you have that ability to motivate yourself and stay hungry for achieving the goal that you set yourself.
I obviously completely agree with what you just said there. And I think, like, we just spent a few minutes saying that to feel good to do a long swim, you have to do these long swims and build up. But it's also really important to tell you that you can't do too many. No. Like if we said, okay, Sarah's going to do 25 dives between 120 meters and 135 meters, that's not good either. And the problem is, to do a max attempt or to do a maximum performance, you need to be prepared. You need to have put in both the short distance training, or if you're a deep diver, the shallow training. And then you also need to do this peaking process where you do a controlled exposure to these longer target dives. But if you do too many, you're going to run out of motivation.
Yeah.
Like, if you did 120 every single training session, the urge to do 130 is going to disappear. And if you don't have that urge to do 130, or you don't have the hunger or the motivation or the excitement to do a bit more because you've burnt it all out by doing long swim every single session, then you're going to have these negative emotions, these bad thoughts before the dive. You're going to get earlier contractions because deep down inside that true motivation isn't there. Yeah. So this peaking process is actually quite delicate, where you need to find out, okay, I have minimum long dives that I need to do. In Sarah's case, it's usually about 5 is the minimum. In my case, as a deep diver, it's closer to 8. But you want to be as close to that minimum as possible. If you start getting double your minimum, you're going to start having problems. You're going to lose motivation. Yeah. You're going to lose the urge and the hunger to go for more. And then you're going to have just as many problems and just the same problems as if you didn't do any peaking process at all. Yeah. Which is where the dives, again, start to feel horrible. You feel nervous beforehand, and you feel demotivated before your training.
Yes, you're right. So it's kind of the moral of the story in peaking is don't underdo it, but don't overdo it either. And it is a balance, and sometimes you do have to just, go through a few rounds of this to investigate and experiment. There's sometimes it's not a one size fits all, but there is a rough formula that you can apply. But as I said, it's really fascinating to me as a competitor going on this journey with Nathan as a coach, to realise now and to really understand these different phases of training and why they work, and really trusting them because I've experienced it and because I understand now the pitfalls if I don't, So as a competitor, I'm getting more clued into, okay, well, Sarah, if you don't do this 130, or if you do push over 130 today, this is the cost. Okay, if this is what will happen to you, and your goal if you do that. So I'm learning that, and it's made a massive difference to just knowing, what I should and shouldn't do. So that's been super handy. But yeah, as I said, we're going into the final couple of weeks now, and it's going to be mostly, like I said, long swims all the way. And what we were thinking is then we just check in with you now. We'll do the competition. And then we'll check in with you after to let you know how it went, and to potentially show you the dive for real so you can live it with us. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys, and just want to hand you over to Coach. Do you have anything else to say?
No, I'm That's all I had to say.
That's all he has to say. Okay, well that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye.